this evening. I will shortly hand you over to Christopher de Bellaigue, who will chair tonight's discussion with Scott Anderson. Before I do, if I can ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we're broadcasting live. And of course, after the event, you are very welcome to pick up one of Scott's books over in the corner there. So over to Chris.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's a compliment to Scott Anderson that this place is absolutely full, and also to the quality of his book, and not undeserved, because I think Scott Anderson has done something very original and very new to the T.E. Lawrence story. And it's a story that, among all Britain's heroes, war heroes or anti-heroes of the 20th century, is probably better known than almost any other. I think it requires a great deal of courage to go to your publisher and say, I want to write a book about T.E. Lawrence. But Scott has managed to do it, and I think the way that he's managed to pull it off with such style is to take a step back from Lawrence, the personality, the tortured personality that has been obsessed over for so long, starting perhaps with the famous David Lean film, and then going on to biography upon biography, this kind of taking apart of Lawrence's mind in ever more obsessive attempt to understand what made the man tick. And Scott Anderson has taken a step back, and he's situated Lawrence he's made him part of a quartet, a kind of group portrait. And we'll discuss that later on. We learn a great deal from his book about not simply what was happening in the Levant and in Arabia during the First World War, but also, by implication, what was happening on the Western Front, because these two are the yin and the yang of the First World War. So I want to welcome you, Scott.
Thanks, Chris.
And I want to start by asking you what it felt when you put in that request and you said, T.E. Lawrence, have you heard of him?
Right. Well, you're right. I think at last count there's something like 70 or 80 biographies that have been done on Lawrence. And having spent a lot of time in the Middle East, one thing I just found whenever I had a detailed conversation with anybody, a conversation of substance, it didn't matter their political or religious background, invariably people traced the roots of the problem in the region back to the peace that was imposed upon them at the end of World War I. So it was always in the back of my mind that I wanted to explore that period of history, which frankly I didn't know that much about. And part of the attraction was that I knew that Lawrence had played a pivotal role in that. I'd seen the movie as a kid and been utterly enamored of it. But in contemplating trying to think of something new about Lawrence, I went back to what I think is the core riddle of Lawrence's life, which is, how did he do it, essentially? I mean, how did a 28-year-old Oxford scholar, painfully shy Oxford scholar, without a single day of military training, how did that guy go off to Arabia and become a battlefield commander of a rebel army? Not just a rebel army, but a rebel Muslim army. And there's I think, several different factors involved, one being a peculiar genius that Lawrence had, but one being also that he was able to do it because no one was paying that much attention. This was in the midst of World War I. Certainly for the British, 95% of their blood and treasure was being expended on the Western Front. So if this rather eccentric junior officer could go off to Arabia and cause problems for the Turks, who were allied with the Germans, well then go to it. And so he had a tremendous amount of freedom of movement, freedom of action, which he very much capitalized on. Lawrence was a master of missing, so-called missing orders that he didn't want that he wanted to take. He would get telegrams from the British headquarters in Cairo ordering him to do something, and he would send a message back saying "garbled in transmission," and then go off and do what he wanted to do. So he just had this incredible freedom of movement that he wouldn't have had in any other theater in the war, and from having this kind of a miniature epiphany about Lawrence, I got thinking, well, if that was true about the British, who were by far the biggest imperial players in the region during World War I, then it must have been true about the other warring powers. And from that, I found these other characters, which we can talk about down the road.
Well, I think we should, because they really give so much context and also a great deal of unexpected colour to the book, because they are undoubtedly less well known. Why don't you take us through them in ascending order, in my opinion, of importance? And I regret to say that the least important, but one of the more enjoyable characters is William Yale, your compatriot, who was very well connected. He was a WASP. He came out as an oil man, but then he somehow sort of bungled his way into government service. How did that happen, and how were you drawn to William Yale?
It's a typical American success story. Yale he was actually of the Yale family, which is founded Yale University. William Yale was Yankee blue blood from an incredibly wealthy family. Really at the end of the Gilded Age, and William Yale was. Just had this incredibly privileged life. His father lost everything. It's a typical American failure story. His father lost everything in the financial panic of 1907, and in 1 year, William Yale went from being one of the richest young men in America, and was a freshman at Yale University, and then by the next summer he was working as a junior engineer on the Panama Canal, and he had to pay his way through school. He ends up getting a job with Standard Oil of New York and coming to the Ottoman Empire to prospect for oil, to look for oil concessions. The interesting thing at the time, there was a kind of a global hunt on for the next big oil strike, and what all the geologists of the time thought was that the next big oil find was going to be around the Dead Sea, on the border of modern-day Israel and Jordan. So that was the area that Standard Oil gather up huge oil concessions. And of course, the Americans didn't come into the war until 1917, so Lawrence stayed in Ottoman Syria, in Jerusalem, until 1917. When the Americans came into the war, he left, he went back to Washington. He finally got the notice of the State Department saying, I've just spent 4 years in Ottoman Syria. So they made him a special agent of the State Department. So he came back to Cairo as the only American field intelligence officer in the Middle East, and proceeded to almost all his reports. I mean, again, there's something quintessentially American about William Yale's experience. He sent weekly reports back to New York, and I was never able to find any record that anyone actually read these reports. There were a couple of very short, cryptic cables back to him. But virtually no one was paying any attention, and most of the information he was sending back was wrong in any event. So
now he had contact with Lawrence. He certainly met Lawrence, and they corresponded in later life.
That's right. That's right. They actually met just prior to the war when it was this. It's a great. It's actually the way I began the book, but it's this great moment where they're in the Negev desert, and Lawrence is there. He's there as a secret military intelligence mission to map the western approach, the eastern approaches to British Egypt, to like the eastern Sinai. But it's under the cover of this archaeological expedition. But in fact, it was being done by the Royal Engineers, and they were militarily mapping the area. He meets William Yale out in the desert, and William Yale is secretly prospecting for oil. But his cover story is that he's what they called at the time a playboy. He's supposed to be on a grand tour of the biblical sites of the Holy Land. So these two, and they were almost the same age. At this point, they were 26. And they meet out in the desert, and there's this cat and mouse game between the two of them, because they both have false stories, and they're trying to figure out what the other one's doing there. And then they continue to meet each other over the course of the war.
The second character is Karl Prufer,
right.
And he's altogether more of a heavyweight, even though he ends up back in Berlin, slightly out of events. But tell us about him, and also about his love life, because he has an interesting love life.
He does have an interesting love life. Prufer was also an Oriental scholar. It came from a similar background as Lawrence. He was a scholar, and he was something of a prodigy at languages. He spoke about 9 or 10 different languages. He worked as what they call the Oriental secretary, which was at the German embassy in Cairo before the war. And Oriental secretary is sort of a shadow man. He's going out and he's meeting dissidents, malcontents among the local society, and so Prufer before the war was kind of working as kind of quiet agent provocateur.
And this, of course, is when Egypt is under
British rule. That's right.
Rule.
And the Germans are actively trying to undermine British rule in any way they can. When the war starts in 1914, Prufer's back in Germany. He's hired on. He comes back out to basically to run the black operations for the Germans. He ends up becoming the counterintelligence chief for the Germans in Syria, and a very feared figure. William Yale, who was in Jerusalem at the time, was terrified of Prufer, because Prufer had the power to kick in doors anywhere and haul people off to either be hung or sent into exile. And the great detail about Prufer, it's like you couldn't put this in a novel, but he'd had a botched throat operation as a kid, so everybody described his voice as this feathery whisper. So just the idea of this guy kicking in your door to haul you off to prison, talking in this little whisper. It's just I've always loved that image. But he comes up with the idea. A lot of the Jewish settlers in Palestine when the war starts, are leaving, and a lot are going to British-held Egypt. So Prufer comes up with the idea that a great way to spy on what the British are up to in Egypt is to turn some Jewish settlers who are on their way to Egypt and have them spy for Germany, and Jews would be a natural candidate for this because, of course, Tsarist Russia was in the alliance with Britain and France, and any Jew at the time had an absolute loathing for Tsarist Russia. So one of the first people he sent was his lover, who was a woman named Minna Weitzman, who was the younger sister of Chaim Weitzman, who was the head of the British Zionist Federation and would go on to become the first president of Israel. Minna Weitzman, she was a doctor, and so she went to Cairo and for several months was sort of the toast of British Cairo because she was a woman doctor, which was a novelty at the time and very beautiful. And when she got caught spying, and at the time people were being put in front of firing squads they were caught for spying, but she was so beloved in Cairo that everybody sort of rallied to her side, including the Russian ambassador. And she was sent into exile to Russia. She came back after the war. She actually ended up returning when the state of Israel was created. But the interesting thing is, Prufer then later went on. He survived the war. He ends up becoming a very high-ranking Nazi diplomat. So when Chaim Weitzman wrote his autobiography, it's 900 pages.
Any mention of the sister?
Huh?
Any mention of the sister?
No mention of Minna at all. She is not mentioned at all.
Yeah, he needed 100 pages for her, I think.
Yeah. No, and unfortunately, she's there's very little to find out about her anywhere, including in Israel. Even in Israel, this idea that the first family of Israel had this woman who was a German spy is just a little too much. So she's pretty much disappeared. So.
Well, you've given her a certain. You've put her back in the limelight where I think she belongs. Now, the third character leads on neatly from this because it comes really to what I think is one of the sort of the main issues of the book, which is the creation of Israel, and which, of course, is anticipated by events happening in the First World War. And your character, Aronson, who is a really fascinating character. He was a Romanian Jew. He came to Palestine as a settler, as a young man, as a young boy, and grew up there. So in a way, he's the only one of your quartet who has a vested interest in the land. He's the only one who's actually going to make that place his home. And what I love about the evolution of this character is the way that he changes from being a loyal Ottomanist. He's an agronomist and a very celebrated one. He's given charge of combating a plague of locusts in 1915, to becoming a paid-up spy for the British. How did that conversion take place?
Yeah, I think it happened. You mentioned the locust plague. Aronson was given, because he was the leading agronomist probably in the entire region, so he was put in charge by the Ottoman Governor General to combat this plague of locusts, and so he traveled throughout the region, and one thing he saw was just the utter squalor and the destruction that was happening. Everything was being requisitioned by the Ottoman army, the Turkish army, so people were being left utterly destitute. But he was also seeing the remnants of the Armenians who had been cast out of Armenia and were ending up in northern Syria, and he feared that the Jewish settlers in Palestine might be next, and he made this decision that any Jewish future in the region, they had to switch sides. And so through a very torturous process, he set up a spy ring throughout Palestine of Jewish settlers.
And he had trouble gaining the British trust, didn't he?
That's right. Two different attempts and again, because the British at this time were in Egypt, two different times he got people to Egypt to tell the British there was this very extensive and very good, their information was excellent, spy ring waiting to work for the British. And first time they just didn't believe the courier that Aronson sent, and they kicked him out of Egypt. And then the second one, there was a series of kind of mishaps, but it ended up being almost 2 years before Aronson finally convinced the British that there was a spy ring in place, and put it to work for him. At that point, he was in Cairo, and so he had left running the spy ring to his younger sister, Sarah, in Palestine. And the spy ring ran for about 7 or 8 months, and largely through British mismanagement, it got uncovered. And Sarah, who was 27, I believe, was captured by the Turks, tortured, and she ended up taking her own life. And so she's very much a tragic figure. And Aronson went on to become a quite prominent Zionist leader. He worked with Chaim Weizmann in London, but they constantly butted heads. Aronson goes on to die in a plane crash during the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and so he is similarly rather airbrushed out of history. There's very little in Zionist history. Zionist history, which Chaim Weizmann kind of wrote. He again, I go back to his biography. I think there's 2 paragraphs on Aaron Aronson, although he played an absolutely pivotal role.
But in a way, Aronson is the victor, the victorious party of the fall, because obviously Prufer was frustrated. Yale did his thing and then went back, and then the sort of titanic struggle at the heart of this book is between the pro-Arabs and the Zionist cause. And Lawrence, of course, was frustrated in his wish to stand up and uphold the Arab cause. And as you said in your book, when was it he made that very prescient comment?
Well, it's funny, he actually made it to William Yale. He said that if a Jewish primacy or a Jewish state, I'm paraphrasing slightly, in Palestine can only ever be achieved by force of arms, and it can only ever be maintained by force of arms. And this was shortly after the Balfour Declaration, which came out in the fall of 1917. And it was a time when the British leadership were very sanguine about this idea that Jewish settlers would be accepted by the indigenous Palestinian population. Mark Sykes, who was a diplomatic gadfly at the time, famously said, "Oh, they're Semitic cousins. They will get along fabulously. Cannot foresee any problems here at all." And Lawrence really did understand that this was going to be just a huge battle.
Is in your reading of these other characters, did I mean one senses an affection for Lawrence in your book? Did that survive the whole process of reading and going through him? And and really sort of digesting what he did and what he meant. Did that survive? And does he stand above the others in your estimation?
Oh, he definitely stands above the others, both by his personality, but and also by for instance, the Americans, they were very much a footnote in the Middle East at the time. So both by the force of Lawrence's personality and by the role the British played in the region, Lawrence is very much the primary character, I think, in the book. And yeah, my affection did stay for him. I was especially touched by, I mean, in the last days of the war, Lawrence became increasingly tortured in the field by having torn between these dual allegiances to the British Crown and to the Arab rebels that he, after all, was helping to recruit and fight for a cause, the cause being Arab independence. While he knew full well that the probability, because he knew about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was a secret accord that divided up the region between British and French, he became, I think he felt, well, he very clearly felt increasingly conflicted by, he called himself a fraud and a charlatan in his memoir, Seven Pillars of Wisdom. And towards the end of the war, he had this idea that to salvage the promises that had been made to the Arabs for independence, and especially the independence of Syria, which had been promised to the French, that he could somehow subvert this imperial deal if he could somehow get the Arab rebels to Damascus before the British army. And so there was this mad dash in September of 1918, where General Allenby with the regular British troops are moving up through Palestine, and Lawrence and the Arab rebels are moving up through the interior of Syria towards Damascus. And it's very clear he became rather mad in the field. Famously, about 3 or 4 days before Damascus fell, and the Turks are in headlong retreat, just trying to really get back to the Turkish heartland. Lawrence came into this village where the retreating Ottoman Turks had basically slaughtered a village and massacred a village. And so he ordered his men. There was a column of 2,000 Turkish and German troops fleeing on the road, and he ordered his men to take no prisoners. He said, no quarter. And so this column got divided up, and over the course of this day, they were all wiped out, except as Lawrence is returning to his base camp and that afternoon, that early evening, he finds one group of his soldiers hadn't received a no quarter order, and they took 250 Germans and Turks prisoners, and they're just sitting disarmed on the side of the road, and he orders them machine gunned, and he puts it in his official report that I ordered the Hotchkiss being machine gun, I ordered the Hotchkiss turned on them and made an end of them. 3 weeks after that, he's at Buckingham Palace to be knighted by the king, and he refuses the knighthood. I think Lawrence became a really troubled. I think it worked on two levels. Of course, in the war, the Arabs, at the end of the war, the Arabs are betrayed ultimately at the Paris Peace Conference. So I think he was tortured by having failed to live up to that promise, to uphold it, but also by his personal experiences in the war. It's very clear in the post-war period that he suffered from what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder. He had bouts of depression. He became increasingly reclusive. He changed his name. He was a celebrity, and all he wanted to do was disappear. I think it's very. It's so long answer to your question. I do feel affection for Lawrence because I think he was. I think he was a casualty ultimately of the war.
And of course, the point at which your book ends is really the beginning of the story that we now are living with, and the consequences of which we're now witnessing. And Lawrence retains this extraordinary celebrity across, or notoriety perhaps, across the Middle East. And as I was saying before we came up, when I was in eastern Turkey some years ago writing a book and just poking around the sort of badlands of Kurdistan and formerly Armenia, I was under a certain amount of scrutiny by the local forces of authority, wondering what the hell I was up to. And one captain, the captain of that particular district, approached me, having scrutinized me for some days, not really understood what I was doing. And what he said to me was, "Who are you? Are you another Lawrence?" And this is a captain, and he's been through the Turkish system, and they have instilled in him the idea that Lawrence, and by extension, the British and the imperialists, are still interested in dismembering Turkey and the Ottoman Empire. Now, you came out of this book with a great admiration for Ataturk, the man who kept a Turkish homeland together.
Right. Yeah, I've spent quite a bit of time in Turkey as well, and one thing I mean, Ataturk is officially adored in Turkey, and I never quite understood what, is this state imposed, or is this a genuine affection for this man who founded the Turkish Republic? But when you read the history of that time, Turkey would just not look anything like it does today without Kemal Ataturk. It occurred to me at one point that there's really, I can only think of 3 self-made men who came out of World War I. Men who, were not generals, were not princes, were not kings, but by the force of their own personality, changed history, and that history would have been very different without them there. And it's Lawrence, and it's Ataturk and Lenin. Those are the 3 that I think just fundamentally changed history without, kind of unexpectedly.
Yeah. How long are we doing for? Do I have to? I mean, I would love to turn it over to the floor, but I'm having so much fun. Is it all right if I carry on a bit? You take a really well-aimed pot shot at a very cherished British institution in your book, and that is the institution of the gentleman amateur. Now, amateur in British culture suggests someone who's disinterested, someone who's not in it for the money, someone who's in it for the love or the fun of it. And you've set up some big-time amateurs, and you've absolutely demolished them. And Sykes was one of them. Right. Ormsby Gore was another of them. Tell us what your perspective is on the British amateur.
Well, it was such a peculiar moment, and the amateurs, as I'm sure most people, they had these incredible lives. Mark Sykes had 3 patents, 3 inventions. He had been an Undersecretary of Parliament. He had written 5 books. He had been an honorary consul in Istanbul, and that was all before the age of 30. It's just one after another of these people had incredible
unqualified
lives.
For any of these.
Completely unqualified for all of them. But they all were titled. They were all young aristocrats, and of course the world had become much smaller with transportation, and so it was incredibly déclassé for these people to have jobs. So they didn't. None of them had actual jobs, and I think it was. So when World War I started, all of a sudden these people who had been sort of flitting about the world were given some of them, including Mark Sykes, most deadly. It was given a real position of power.
Because we should explain that we should explain the importance for those who don't know of the Sykes-Picot Agreement.
The Sykes-Picot Agreement was the secret. Just to jump back a bit, just when the Arab Revolt started in the summer of 1916, it was the result of the British having entered into a pledge to King Hussein of the Hijaz in Arabia, basically promising blanket Arab independence for virtually the entire Middle East. So a couple of little what would today be southern Iraq and Lebanon being excluded, but virtually everything else was promised to the Arabs in return for rebelling against the Turks. 5 months later, Mark Sykes and French diplomat Georges Picot signed the secret deal, basically carving up the entire Middle East between the French and British spheres of influence, with the future Arab independent state being relegated to the desert wastelands of Arabia. completely secret agreement. So Sykes was, and again with very little adult supervision. Sykes and Pico sat in a townhouse in London, and over the course of a day or two, carved up the Middle East between themselves. And then Sykes was also one of the prime movers behind the Balfour Declaration. Balfour
He changed his mind a lot as well, didn't he?
Constantly, and the power that Sykes had, and some of his writings are just are priceless. He did this. He was a master of the PowerPoint. 80 years before the PowerPoint had been invented, he would do these very elaborate but very precise memos. He was always sending memos to the Foreign Office, and he divided up the people of Egypt into 8 different classes, and it was like type 3 Oriental, type 2 modern, and so everybody was supposed to fit into these archetypes, and especially in the midst of World War I, where the senior people in the government, they're looking at stuff going all over the world. This was very reassuring to get this memo that was so absolutely self-assured, and converted these rather complicated issues into very easy to digest, and everything. With Mark Sykes, everything had a simple solution, and so I say in my book that without malice, Mark Sykes probably has caused more heartache in the world in the 20th century than any other person.
No one's cast doubt on the goodness of his heart or his
Right.
good intentions, and he also is the author of that amazing, wonderful remark which you mention in your book, the meeting at which it was decided that the Balfour Declaration should be issued, with this statement that the Jews should have their national home. He was present and he came out, and Weizmann was sitting out there waiting to see what has happened, and Sykes looked at him and said, "It's a boy."
That's right.
So this takes us forward, or it certainly takes me forward, to events of a more contemporary nature and interventions that the Americans and the British and others have been involved in. And also it takes us back to this idea of amateurs, because the invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan have both been run by amateurs. And as a result, they've both been botched. Or am I wrong?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Lowercase a on the amateurs, and the British amateurs, it was usually uppercase a. But yes, no, absolutely. And famously, David Petraeus, the American general, I think it was in 2007, suddenly discovers Lawrence's writings about how as a foreign army, as a foreign officer, you should deal with Arabs. And Lawrence wrote this. He wrote this memo for British officers who were going to Syria and to Arabia to assist the Arab rebels, and it was called 27 Articles, and it was 27 points of what you should and should not do. And some of them are quite interesting. I mean, he says things like, "It's better that the Arab do something half as well as you, but they do it for themselves rather than you do it." But some of the articles are also things like, "If you want to take a slave, choose this tribe, but don't take that slave into this part of the Hijaz because he'll be killed." But anyway, Petraeus, I think it was about 2007, 2008, all of a sudden discovers Lawrence's 27 Articles and makes all his juniors, his staff, read it. It's finally like, oh, so this is what we should have been doing all along, of how to treat Arabs. But the funny thing about that too is that the preface, the second sentence of Lawrence's 27 Articles, he says this only applies to how you get along with Bedouins. Dealing with like town or city Arabs is a completely different thing. And of course, in Iraq, Bedouins are 2% of the population. So even then, Petraeus got it wrong. But no, absolutely, there has been this. I think that anyone who knew a little bit about the region, certainly prior to the American invasion of Iraq, and there were people out there in the same way that Lawrence was saying to the British, of you have to look at the clan and tribal structure in these places. You are not going to create an army, in Lawrence's case, along conventional Western European models. It's more like medieval Europe of how you form an army, and you have to always be cognizant of where the fault lines, the feud lines lie, and what tribes and clans work in conjunction. And people, and it wasn't very many probably in the United States, but there were people in the United States prior to the Americans jumping into Iraq who were warning about this, and they were utterly brushed aside. I mean,
The Lawrences of today.
Or even the academics, the scholars, that were very aware that Iraq, throughout the region, Syria today, it's a very complex society. And the Americans, in 2003, they believed that they were going to be greeted as heroes, as liberators, because they wanted to believe that. So,
just remembering your comment about Ataturk, and thinking about the characters in your book, it seems to me that one of the great attributes of Ataturk is that, as you say, he made the destiny of his own country without asking anyone's permission. And the other people who were in charge of the destiny of the Middle East were outsiders, and whether they were well-intentioned or ill-intentioned, whatever their perspective on things was, they didn't have that essential stake in the land. And that leads me to believe that there's a sort of vacuum in our reading of history, from the fact that we don't know enough, or we don't credit enough those local actors. Having said that, I could argue back at myself that Sheriff Hussein of Mecca, who Lawrence won over and encouraged, was absolutely dependent on British, as he saw,
Absolutely.
goodwill. So how do we square this problem, this vacuum?
yeah, I think the reason it certainly at that time in 1918, 1919, I don't even know if it was so much that I think they just didn't care, the Europeans. I think one thing that's important to remember about World War I, so much of what informed World War I, certainly in the notion, World War I was not just about the preservation of empire, which is what I think prior to working on this book, I had always thought that's what it was. It was actually about the expansion of empire. The empires of Europe at that time, it's a great irony because of the 6 empires of Europe, only 2 were left at the end of the war, and those 2, the British and the French, would be gone within a generation. But so much of, when you look at the Middle East at that time, it was really animated by what had happened in Africa, the scramble for Africa. And in the prior 40 years, an entire continent had been taken over, colonized, virtually bloodlessly. And so the European powers, Britain and France, but also Germany, they were looking at what was next. And even the Germans saw the Ottoman Empire was, the proverbial sick man of Europe. And that was the next area that was going to go. The rest of the world was pretty much spoken for. It's funny, in the Foreign Office, as soon as the Ottomans joined in Germany in the war, they started referring to the Ottoman Empire as the Great Loot, because that's what was going to happen if the British won the war. They were going to just pilfer the Ottoman Empire. So it's this. I think it's this classic case of being on the wrong side of history. That the British and the French really thought that having won the war, that this was now going to be their next Tanganyika, their next Morocco. Mm-hmm. And it was just a classic misreading. And certainly Lawrence, knowing Arab culture, and this was the part of Lawrence I think stayed as a British patriot. That part of what motivated him was the affection and loyalty he felt for the Arabs, but part of it also being that he just saw the British government just heading into disaster.
Scott, I'm going to throw you to the wolves now.
Yeah.
So, you.
Thank you very much. I haven't read your book, but can I ask you about Gertrude Bell? You know, she's a very, very interesting woman and really a major figure.
Yep.
And some people have said that she's actually more important than Lawrence ever was. How do you assess her, and what have you done about her in the book?
I actually don't talk about Gertrude Bell in my book, and I'll tell you why. She was a remarkable figure. She was during the war. Prior to the war. She had done tremendous expeditions across the Arabian Peninsula, and had produced some of the maps. But she'd been mostly in what we would say today would be northern Saudi Arabia, which was an area that the war in World War I, the Arab Revolt, never spread to. And then during the war, she was mostly in Iraq and Mesopotamia, where the fighting was primarily, and certainly the fighting that changed the shape of the region, was in Syria and Palestine. Where Gertrude Bell had a huge influence was at the Cairo Conference in 1920, where she worked with Winston Churchill. I think I mentioned earlier, as soon as the French and the British divided up the region in 1919, everything went to hell. And Iraq was in flames. There was riots in Egypt. There was killings in Palestine. So the British very quickly, they named Winston Churchill the colonial secretary, and he was basically the Band-Aid man to try to change things. So he had it was called the Cairo Conference, where Gertrude Bell played a huge role, along with Lawrence. But probably, I mean, the biggest problem the British faced at the time was in Iraq. So certainly Bell had a much bigger hand in reshaping things there than Lawrence would have.
She's responsible for the map of Iraq. She's
Iraq,
the person
yes.
who drew that.
That's right.
And a tremendous Arabist,
Right.
a most extraordinary figure. No, thank you.
Yeah.
That'll be your next book, I think.
Yeah.
This gentleman in the blue jumper.
From the Gertrude Bell to the film, if we could do that. I mean, I've never actually heard, like Christopher Sykes in Crossroads to Israel, which actually Mark Sykes produced Christopher, which I think is an astonishing book. I don't know how you felt about it. But there is a scene in the film that I think is kind of, I mean, my roommate was Michelle, who dies of the dynamite cap, so I was sitting with Arthur Miller when Kennedy was killed, and later I was in school with Godfrey Glubb, and then ended up with Israeli Nuclear later in life. And there's one scene which seems to have bedeviled the last 13 years, and it's that scene at the end of the film. I think Robert Bolt did quite a good interpretation of the film in some ways. The scene where Lawrence gives the Arabs Damascus, and the Bedouin chiefs run around on top of tables, and in the last scene they go off into the dust on their camels, lolloping along, going back to their tribalism.
Right.
And that somehow represents all of that mandate, condescension, the colonizing and whatever. I wonder if you thought very much. I mean, I've often heard politicians in the last 13 years refer to that scene condescendingly as, well, after all, the Arabs can't do anything beyond going back. How do you feel Arabs feel about that scene? Because I've often heard Arabs comment it also bitterly.
Yeah. Well, I think that Arabs in general feel quite bitter about, not just about the film, but about Lawrence, and I can understand why. The Arab Revolt is the creation story of the Arab people of after 500 years of Ottoman rule, and why is this 5'4" Brit always at center stage of their story? And there, I think the David Lane movie is amazing in so many ways, but there are elements of extreme condescension that come through. So I imagine it quite grates on them. But I think probably it grates on them more for this idea that in fact nothing's really changed in Hollywood. If you do a movie about Africa, there still has to be a white person in the center of it.
Reflects the nature of the mandate, which we then in 35 inherit. The Americans take over from the English, which leads to this amateurishness you're talking about.
Yeah, probably so.
If Scott is also you write screenplays, don't you?
Yeah.
If you were to take a new look at Lawrence, it's about time someone did. What
Yeah,
would
it's a
you
tough
what would you concentrate on? What would you look at?
That's an excellent question. You know, I don't. And I haven't thought about it before because I just think that movie is such a classic. It's on everybody's, top 10 films of all time list. I don't think that movie is ever going to be re-read. Right? There's not going to be any remake of Lawrence of Arabia. I think probably the notion that and I'm going to paraphrase very badly, but at one point Lawrence is saying, if the Arabs they're, as long as they continue this way, they're always going to be a small and ugly people. And yet, then the Omar Sharif responds to that. It's like, oh, he's right. There are some things that really date the film, but I think what makes that film so wonderful is that it really, while getting a lot of the facts wrong of Lawrence's life, it somehow arrives at it kind of gets at a bigger truth, at least about Lawrence. It gets across this idea of this tortured individual, and a very odd, very peculiar man, and Peter O'Toole really captured that.
I agree. Gentleman with the spectacles over there.
Thank you. You've talked about T. Lawrence's sympathy for the Arab cause, and of course you also talked briefly about Mark Sykes's role in the Balfour Declaration. I'm just wondering if you could expand a little bit more on the British establishment and how the differences in opinion on Zionism and on the Arab cause, how that played out in the British establishment during this period.
Yeah. One of the among the tragic stories of Lawrence is at the end of the war, right after the taking of Damascus, immediately after the taking of Damascus, 2 days the Arabs got there first, technically, virtually in the same day as the British Army. He set up an administration for Faisal's arrival, and so there was this interim Arab government. 2 days later, General Allenby arrives in Damascus, and there's this meeting at the Victoria Hotel in Damascus where Faisal basically lays claim to Syria, and Allenby says, it's been promised to the French, and he turns to Lawrence and says, you know that, surely you told him that. And so right at that moment, the fix was in. And the very poignant thing about this meeting was Faisal had arrived in this kind of moment of triumph, and people greeting him in the streets as the king of Syria, and he walked out of the hotel basically already overthrown. And Lawrence asked to stay behind and to talk to Allenby, and what he said to Allenby was, I want to quit, essentially. I want to go home. And Allenby, this was October 3rd of 1918, and the war was still on. And Allenby said, no, you can't. I need you, as we were still pursuing the Turks north. And Lawrence basically said, I'll be of no use to you. I'm done. And so literally the next day, Lawrence left Damascus, never to return. He never saw Damascus again, the city that he had used as a battle cry, on to Damascus for 2 years to rally the Arabs. Would never return to the city. He came back to London, and he came back and prior to the beginning of the Paris Peace Conference, lobbied within the British political structure to finding allies who would stand by, who would uphold the promises that had been made to the Arabs. At the Paris Peace Conference, he was the official liaison for Faisal, King Hussein's son, the Arab delegation to the Paris Peace Conference, and first tried with the British and got nowhere. Went to the Americans to try to get, because Woodrow Wilson had come over with this idea that he was arguing for the self-determination of small peoples, as he referred to it. The Americans had no interest. And one by one, every place Lawrence turned, he was cold-shouldered, to the point where the British Foreign Office finally decided that Lawrence had become sort of the traitor within. He was standing in the way of just wrapping up this problem and making an accord with the French and getting on with things. So he ended up being virtually officially banned from the Paris Peace Conference and barred from communicating with Faisal. And he was still in the military, so he was sent to a barracks and just kept out of sight. And this was also at a time when Lowell Thomas, the American journalist slash huckster, had turned Lawrence into this matinee idol, and overflowing crowds of British were going to this moving picture show that Lowell Thomas was.
And it went on tour, didn't it?
It went on tour. Over 1 million Britons saw this show, and Lawrence was a war hero. And so at the same time that the British public is discovering this very romanticized view of Lawrence in Arabia, his own government is basically putting him out to pasture. So it was a very poignant thing. I'm not sure I answered your question, though.
I think you did very well. Over there, you sir.
As a documentary film student, I saw Lawrence of Arabia and was really rather inspired, and spent a lot of the last 40 years making documentaries in the Middle East. And I've asked many, many, many people who live there what they feel about Lawrence of Arabia. And invariably, it's Lawrence who. It's Lawrence who. Now, maybe this means you should go for an Arabic translation. Maybe there's a market there. But I was always rather disappointed, because I so enjoyed the film, but I've never found any sort of resonance in terms of his legacy.
Huh. I mean, I think at this point it would. Well, it's interesting because I was talking with the Syrian today, and he was saying when he grew up, well, in his father's and his, I suppose, grandfather's generation, he was very much a revered figure in say the 1920s, 1930s, to the point where a lot of Lawrence is actually a rather common name in Syria. They saw him as the one Westerner who had tried to stand up. But then, again, according to the Syrian I was talking to today, it switched into where they saw him as an agent of British imperialism. And to the degree that he's taught at all about in schools in the Middle East today, it's probably as that he was an agent of British imperialism. And I suspect that there's I mean, I don't know what areas in the region you've been in.
Well, for example, in Jeddah, I saw a house that was, I believe, where he lived. I think it went on to be some sort of diplomatic building owned by Britain. And I rather jokingly said to somebody of certain influence, why don't you put a plaque up? I mean, damn it, that's the house of Lawrence of Arabia.
Right.
And there was a real resistance.
Right.
That's just taking Saudi Arabia.
Right.
There are other countries.
Yeah.
Syria.
Well, I wonder too how much of it goes back to this idea that you know the Arab Revolt was the seminal moment in Arab history after 500 years of subjugation by the Ottoman Turks, and so why do we have to memorialize this British officer and give him sort of authorship of our story? I would suspect it's probably partly that of if he's been sort of airbrushed out of the histories of the area, I suspect that's probably why.
Yes. Sorry, we're making you run around, Millicent.
You talked about the end of the film and that Lawrence said they all took off either on camel or horseback or whatever, back to their tribes, and that's what the Arabs are all about. This tribal dimension, which really rules the thinking and where their souls are. And here we are in the 21st century. We only had to read the newspaper today to find out what's happening in Egypt and the murderous action of just taking lives and killing people because they're fundamentalists. Do you think any lessons have been learned?
I don't know if lessons have been learned. No, I don't think so. I'm sometimes asked what Lawrence would say if he came back today and saw the Middle East, and I've always thought that what he would say is, "I told you so." I think he predicted a lot of. with this art, these art, and Egypt actually not being an artificial. I mean, Egypt goes back. The boundaries of Egypt today are essentially what they were 3,000 years ago. But with the rest of the Middle East, the artificial these artificial nation states, which are now fracturing one after the other, and I think, trying to figure out what Lawrence's remedy was, what his solution for the Middle East was, is a bit tricky because Lawrence was this kind of a master strategist or tactician. So if he was writing a letter to a British imperialist, he would sound a bit imperialist to try to win them over. But certainly he thought that the Arabs had to be independent. That the degree to which the British or the French tried to exert their will in the region, that it was going to come to tears. But I don't think he ever was so naive to think that there was going to be this grand unified one Arab nation. I think what he thought, what he hoped for, and I think even looking at today, if you can kind of, I think we're in for a long period of darkness in the Middle East, but if perhaps 30, 40 years up the road, it seems that that the region is going back to its component parts. I mean, Iraq today is essentially three countries. Libya is 3 countries, and it's very much along the lines of the same divisions that were set up by the Ottoman Empire. But if there's anything that unites the region, I think it is this notion of pan-Arabism, which is actually, I think, runs quite deep. So maybe what you have is almost kind of a version of the EU, where the notion of the nation-state boundary becomes less and less important, and you have much more regional autonomy. And yet you that on this kind of supranational level, you have some sort of joint administration. I mean, it's really hard to imagine this happening, anytime in our lifetimes. But I think that's the hope that's out there for the region.
Yes. Oh, yeah, gentleman in the cap.
Hi. I haven't read the book either, so apologies for that. We know that Lawrence dealt with Sharif Hussein and his sons in history. Where did the House of Saud come in and take over Saudi Arabia? 'Cause if you can, how did he deal with them in any way, or how did the British get them?
Yeah, it's another great irony of the time that Ibn Saud was the tribal leader of the Najd, which is, again, this area of northern, what today is Saudi Arabia. King Hussein's family from the Hijaz, and sworn enemies. And Ibn Saud had allied himself with the Wahhabis, extreme fundamentalists, and Ibn Saud had his British agent, and certainly King Hussein had his British agents in Jeddah, and part of Ibn Saud overthrew Hussein in 1925, overthrew the Hashemite dynasty, and one large reason he was able to do so was because Hussein had failed to produce on Arab independence from the British and the French. He was seen as a dupe or a stooge of the Western imperialists, and this very much worked against him, and it helped unite Arab tribes to Ibn Saud to overthrow Hussein and to bring into, and that's where the name Saudi Arabia comes from, and to bring in a much more severe, austere form of Islam to the Arabian Peninsula than would have existed under King Hussein.
And one of the interesting things that the points that you make is that not only did they have British agents of their own, but also the government of British India was at one stage supporting Ibn Saud.
That's right.
At the same time that Lawrence and the British apparatus in Egypt was supporting the Hashemites.
Yeah. They were essentially...
And in fact, British India played a spoiler for a great deal of this because their prism was entirely different.
That's right. That's right. British India wanted a fractured and weak Arab world because In fact, at the time, the country with the biggest Muslim population in the world was India, and they didn't want they didn't want the British and Egypt to go around promising independence to the Arabs while they were crushing any thought of independence for the Muslims in India. So they were terrified at these sorts of progressive ideas that were coming out of British Egypt or London.
And you've been following American foreign policy for a long time. Another big country with lots of arms of government doing strange interventions in various parts of the world. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. Is there something? Is there a lesson to be learnt here about, massive infrastructures, massive bureaucracies trying to working at cross purposes?
Yeah, it's a bit different. I mean, with the Americans, yes, you do have the different ministries but what was fascinating about the British Empire at this point is that it was kind of like a galaxy, with London being maybe the central star, but British India, British South Africa, they had their own foreign policy. They had their own military, and so they acted often in concert with each other, but often in opposition to each other. So it was a very murky time.
Yeah, gentleman at the back there.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to ask a question about Karl Prufer. Did you say Karl Prufer?
Yeah.
What were the German relations with the Turks? What were the German relations with the Arab peoples under the Turkish occupation? And what was the German and Turkish response to the revolt?
Well, the Turks were allied with Germany in the war. They came in a few months after the war started in Europe. One thing that Prufer was trying to do, and this was a wedge that the Germans thought they had especially against the British and the French. The Germans didn't have any Muslim colonies, so they thought basically the idea of Islamic Jihad first started in the German Foreign Ministry, and Prufer was one of their agents trying to spread that idea through the region of getting the Muslims in Egypt to rebel against British rule, the native population in Morocco against France. So, and the British were terrified that this was going to actually spread, because they were already having problems with the British Muslim. The Muslim population in India. It wasn't well known, but there were a couple of mutinies, and Muslim soldiers were the backbone of the British Indian Army. So they were terrified that this idea of Islamic Jihad that the Germans were peddling was going to spread, which in turn is one really important reason of why they made such extravagant promises to King Hussein. King Hussein is the spiritual guardian of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, a hugely important religious figure in Islam. So if the British could get King Hussein to their side, it would really neuter this idea that the British and French are coming back in as modern day crusaders, because the notion that King Hussein would ever go into an alliance with Western imperialists was people just couldn't believe it. So that was a very important factor in why they made such extravagant promises to the Arabs.
Yeah, we'll permit you a second question. Yeah, but everyone else has to hear as well.
The scene really more poignant than any scenes, and it's still playing out in the two-state solution, whatever. I mean, for the Jewish people, it came much later, the talk of the state, the white paper, the Biltmore meeting, etc. But there was a meeting in 1915 that Christopher Sykes describes. And I wonder how many people know that Faisal went on to be the first king of Iraq, and his brother the first king of Transjordan.
Right.
And as Christopher Sykes describes that meeting, and I wonder how much Lawrence had a plan, because he was still with him after that. Faisal said, "I agree with the homeland movement. I will support it." And he made this agreement. And as Christopher Sykes describes it, he said to Chaim Weizmann, But if it ever is their discussion of a Jewish state, the deal is off.
Right.
And Christopher Sykes makes the comment that Faisal had no idea how little political power he made when he made that agreement with Chaim Weizmann. Now, where did T. Lawrence play on this extraordinarily sensitive medium? Because it's still being argued with now.
Right.
The right to exist and everything, it's still there.
Right. It was actually 1919. It was
not before that.
No, it was just before the Paris Peace Conference.
So Christopher Sykes makes mistakes like his father.
Yeah, well, it was this and it was during this period when Lawrence was desperately trying to find a patron, if you will, for the Arab cause at the upcoming Paris Peace Conference, and he ends up taking Faisal to meet with Weizmann here in London, and they form this agreement that in return for Faisal and the Arabs recognizing Jewish primacy, I think was the language, Jewish primacy in Palestine, the Zionists would recognize Faisal's or the Arabs' claims to Syria against the French, but Faisal wrote this asterisk that if it doesn't happen, if the Arabs lose Syria, then we're not going to support Jewish primacy in Palestine. Lawrence was actually the engineer, the architect of this agreement, and I think he did it because it was kind of an act of desperation. Balfour Declaration was a fait accompli. It wasn't like the British government was going to roll it back. So Palestine was already a lost cause in Lawrence's mind. So if we can somehow extract something from that to help us get the Arabs get Syria from the French, it's worth it. The great irony, the double irony of that is that in fact the British would spend the next 25 years doing everything possible to weasel their way out of the Balfour Declaration because they realized what a disaster they had done. And trying to remember what the other irony was. Sorry, it's like, but that was.
There's so many, you forget.
I know. There's ring of irony. So.
I think we've all had a really wonderful hour and a half with you, and it's been absolutely enlightening. I would encourage everyone to come and make a beeline for the books. The book is really absolutely fascinating. It does something that's new, something that's original. It's a completely new take on an old subject. But before you do that, Scott is going to tell us about a little pilgrimage he made the other day.
I was actually, my brother's here. We went. My brother lives down in Dorset, and he and I and his wife went over to Clouds Hill to Lawrence's cottage where he ended up spending just the last few months of his life.
And from which he set off on that fateful day on the motorbike.
That's right.
And how did you find it? How did it reflect the man that you knew?
It's tiny. I'm trying to think, compared to this room, the whole, it's 4 rooms, maybe 1/4 the size of this room. 2 little rooms upstairs, 2 down.
Books?
No books, tons of books, and he was tons of music. He was very much into classical music. No toilet, and no kitchen. But a bathtub. He'd gotten very used to hot weather, and he found English. He would get cold, and so he always one luxury he allowed himself. He had one luxury and one vice. Luxury was hot baths, and vice was speed on motorcycles. And so he ended up having an accident, literally 200 meters down the road from his cottage, and hit his head on the asphalt and died a few days later in 1935. So,
Scott Aronson, many thanks.
Thank you.